Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to today's the Hindu Newspaper Analysis, where we shall be taking a look at the articles which have appeared on 3rd of October 2023. That is today's the Delhi edition of the newspaper. We shall be analyzing those articles in detail and understanding the nuances associated with each one of them. Now, before we proceed with the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for, a minor announcement for all of you. That is, starting tomorrow, that is from 4th of October, we are going to launch a full-scale session for Polity Batch, and that will be for everyone free of cost. Now, if you want to avail that session, please kindly go to the link and the description provided, and you can download the BYJU'S Exam Prep app and attend the entire session worth 25 modules taken by Sarmad Mehraj sir, and thereby you can attend the sessions and areas relevant both for your prelims as well as mains examination and aim for a comprehensive coverage of that particular subject. Again, to reiterate that you can download the Exam Prep app from the link given in the description below. Now, having said that, let us take a look at the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for today. So today in total, we are going to have a discussion for around 7 topics. Now, here, when we take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss, the first of it is the narrative of development and populism. That is the article which has appeared in the editorial page, that is page 6. This is going to be relevant for your GS paper 2, that is for governance. Then, criminal law bills and a hollow decolonization. This particular article talks about the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, the proposed bill which actually seeks to bring about various different changes from how law is followed across the land and basically repeals the Indian Penal Code. So it is that article which basically, in a way, draws a critical angle to the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita bill. So that is what we are going to analyze. This has again appeared in page 6, and this is again going to be relevant for your GS paper 2. Then capturing the rains, again a small snippet has appeared in the editorial section which talks about the vagaries of an uneven distribution of rainfall that we experienced across the country, and what is it that we should do going ahead into the future in order to ensure that the loss and the damage that we have suffered this time, that is not a recurrent phenomena. So this is again from the page of the editorial section, and this is going to be relevant for your GS paper 1 as well as for your GS paper 3, that is for your disaster management. Building BRICS for the future. Now this is about having the relevance of BRICS going ahead into the future, because after this year's meeting, there was a lot of criticism about the relevance of BRICS in today's multilateralism and today's multilateral era of the global geopolitics. So here, the article talks about how BRICS is still going to be relevant going ahead into the future. By the year 2050, BRICS is going to represent 47% of the global population and its role in the global geopolitics. So that is again going to be relevant both for your GS paper 2 as well as for your essay paper as well. Now, certain topics we are going to cover briefly only for relevance of your prelims. That is, Nobel Prizes have been declared for the area of medicine, where you have the Nobel Prize being declared for mRNA kind of vaccine development which has been done. So that is mentioned in page 1. Astra Beyond Visual Range missile is to be inducted by the year end by the Air Force. So that is also, with the help of that article, we'll take a look at what is this BVR missile actually about. And then a malarial vaccine has been developed. And in fact, this marks the second malarial vaccine which has been developed. So that is again relevant for your prelims examination. So let us take a look at these topics one by one, starting with the first topic of the day, and that is narrative of development and populism. So this article in editorial basically deals with the development versus populism debate. Now, this has been ongoing for some time, not only in India, but also across the globe. And this has been a kind of a common trend. And if you analyze the trend in what the global geopolitics is following or what the domestic politics of the various different countries, they are indicating a trend that the various different political parties, the various different governments, they are always in a fix between the development versus populism debate, and that is what the citizenry has also been submerged into. Now, given that we are in an election year, given the fact that we have on the cusp significant number of state as well as the national elections in the offing within the next year, so that is why again the narrative of development and populism comes into the picture. Now here, the article basically suggests very simple mechanism to draw the example that you would observe before elections that there is a string of various different launches of different types of developmental projects, including highways, including manufacturing plants and so on. And also, simultaneously, you will have many different types of political parties who are also, in a way, announcing various different types of guarantees, so to say, to the electorate if they get elected. Recently, we did observe and we did see the Prime Minister launching a slew of various different developmental projects in Madhya Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh is also basically going forward to conduct the election later this year. And meanwhile, an opposition party has declared a set of guarantees to be declared for the state of Telangana, that if it is voted to power, then the citizenry will have certain set of guarantees, be it cheaper gas cylinders, be it free travel for women, and such kind of measures. So here this article talks about the relevance of both of these purposes and what is the role played in the electoral democracy by each one of them. Now, before sinking our teeth deeper into this discussion, we have to understand that in an electoral democracy, every test or the examination is basically the next elections which are to be conducted. So all the political parties, they pay attention to only that kind of crucible or that kind of a test, that whether we are going to be re-elected in the next election or not. Now, in that urge to get re-elected for the next election, it is in that sense that they end up making these kind of promises. But before anything, what do we mean by populism? When you hear the term populism, what does it reflect? So populism, basically, a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. Now, populism overall can be of two different types. When we say populism, we talk about populist policies and populist politics in a general manner. Now here, you can have economic populism as well. You can also have political populism at the same time. Now, what both of them are, we will take a look at it later. But basically, populist politics are what? Or these policies are what? So let's suppose a larger section of population in your own locality, let's suppose they want that in my area, I am paying a lot of taxes. In my area, I should not be paying these kind of taxes. Now, if as your elected representative, I tell you that, okay, if I am elected, you don't have to pay taxes. Now there, I am basically relenting to the popular demand, despite the fact that if my economic situation is not good, the economic situation of the government is not so good, and if I basically cede to these demands, then in a way, I am catering to a particular section of population and ignoring the larger idea or the larger good which can be caused, right? So in that case, also grievance develops from the other section of the society, that we should also get some amount of relief, we should also get maybe tax breaks, maybe this thing should be given to us at free cost, etc. Now, that is where populism doesn't have a kind of a limit. Populism is a kind of an expanseless entity where it keeps on increasing. Let's suppose this year, I have promised you that if you elect me, I will provide you certain aspects or certain materials for free. Next time when again I go to the election, every political party will promise that because everyone wants to get elected. So then everybody will be in a competition to announce something more. Okay, so other than this, these things will also be given free. So in a way, oftentimes it can be self-damaging if, let's suppose, the economic situation of that particular country, of that particular state is not so good. So that is the populism politics about. Now, here, what is it that we see as development? When there is discussion and political clamor call for development to happen, what is it that is development? Now, overall development is a broader term. It does include economic, social, economic and social development. So basically, when you fight malnutrition, when you fight hunger, that is also development. When you build infrastructure, that is also development. When you build industries, that is also development. When you provide employment, that will also be included in development. When, let's say, you bring marginalized section of the population into the mainstream, when you make them a part of the decision-making process, you are going for a social development. And that will also be included in the entirety of the gamut of developmental definition that we talk about. But generally in our country, and that is the case across the world as well, that when development as a concept is talked about, we concentrate only about the physical development, in the sense the development of infrastructure. That is how we end up measuring the rate of development. We have seen it happening in the Western economies. We have seen it happening across the region of the Europe, across China more recently. And also that is a trend being followed in India as well, where development of infrastructure, whereas it brings the economic output and economic growth quite significantly, that is cited as the main aspect of development. And the social indicators, the rural indicators, the indicators reflecting the realities of the society, oftentimes they take a backseat. So in both of these cases, you will have certain drawbacks that you have to confront yourself with. Now here, issues due to such narrow implication of development. Let's suppose that you bring down the entire discussion of development down to physical infrastructure only. Now, what is the outcome of that? Will that always be beneficial? Not always, but will that be beneficial? Yes, it will be. We have seen that basically in United States is a leading example of the growth of infrastructure in the early 1900s. Now, immediately after the Great Depression of 1929 and late 1920s, basically, United States went about a large construction spree where infrastructure across the country was spruced up. And that not only provided job opportunities to large number of population, but on the backbone of that infrastructure, connectivity could be improved, economic outcome could be generated, and eventually favorable outputs for the entirety of the society and for the entirety of the country could be generated. Now, something similar happened in the case of many of the European nations immediately after Second World War. In the case of China, ever since late 70s, that is since the era of Deng Xiaoping. Now, Deng Xiaoping not only opened up the Chinese economy to foreign investments and foreign companies, but Deng Xiaoping also went across and went ahead with the kind of a construction spree that was followed by the later premiers, and that has been followed and carried on forward till the present day era of Xi Jinping as well. Now, in all these cases, you will observe that the physical development, that is the infrastructural development, is used as a backbone to further accelerate the rest of the developmental process. But then, what are the drawbacks associated? First of all, in that wanton search and unsustainable search for sudden economic benefits, many of the times we end up ignoring the environmental costs which are associated. And we have seen the outcome of that. For example, in the region of Himachal Pradesh. Now, Himachal Pradesh this year has basically suffered losses worth tens of thousands of crores due to unending amount of destruction caused because of unsustainable construction across the mountainous areas, blasting done in the tunnels across the mountains. Now that has weakened the slope, that has brought about significant amount of damage and destruction in that area. Uttarakhand. Now in 2023, that is more precisely 2013 rather. In June 2013, Uttarakhand suffered from very devastating Kedarnath disaster or the Kedarnath tragedy. Now, at that point of time, again, the question which was posed in front of the rest of the population was that whether we are basically pushing the nature to the extremity by bringing large amount of population in the ecologically fragile areas. But then immediately after the disaster, when the aspect of rebuilding of Uttarakhand came into the picture, because a lot of infrastructure was destroyed, we basically went ahead and we are going ahead with the Char Dham highway network. Right? Now that in itself, it is alleged, is causing damage to some or the other parts of the environment as well. So here, development versus ecology and development versus environment debate, which basically was put to rest in the 80s itself when you had the concept of sustainable development coming into the picture, that debate is coming back again. Because in that urge for building the physical infrastructure, because the governments, they are basically seeking to outdo each other now, right? Because now when you go to the electorate with the promise that, look, we have basically built these many highways, these many expressways, the other parties will also have a kind of a race that, okay, when we get elected to power, we will basically outdo the other political party. So in that search for that wanton or that unsustainable infrastructural development, that ecological fragility is again being abused. Other than that, in many of the cases, the utility of these infrastructures is also doubtful. That many of the infrastructural projects which are being built, now there is a large doubt which is cast upon them that whether 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, will we be needing those infrastructure projects anymore or not? So that is again a doubt imposed. Now, in carrying out this physical development, infrastructural development, there is a large debt which is basically surmounting on top of all of us. For example, the NHAI, National Highway Authority of India, overall its debt amount right now is close to the tune of 3.43 lakh crores. Okay, so that is the amount of debt that NHAI has basically managed to accumulate on itself. Now, around 2014, that debt amount was 23,000 crores. Now, you can also argue that around 2014, the average, or around 2012, the average length of road constructed every day by NHAI was around 2 kilometers per day. But now that has increased to around 25 to 30 kilometers per day. But nonetheless, that debt amount is very high, and that debt amount is going to haunt us going ahead into the future, whereby if you take a look at it, then servicing that debt, basically paying interest to that debt, repaying that debt in itself, that will cross rupees 50,000 crores in terms of interest payment by the year 2028. So the argument that has been put in the article is that while carrying out the physical infrastructure building, we observe that the debt burden, the economic burden, that is pushed to the future, that is the long term and the mid term future. And that holds the argument against the basic principle that infrastructural development is for long term benefit. Right, generally that is the logic which is put behind that infrastructure development. When you carry out, you are ensuring the growth of a particular region over the next few decades altogether. But here, for the next few decades, you will be basically bridled with all these kinds of unwanted loans and debt as well. So that is the argument, cross argument against it. Now, populism. Now, what is populism? Now, as per Danny Rodriguez, a famous economist in Harvard, now what is populism is, the distinctive trait of populism is that it seeks to represent and speak for the people, which is assumed to be unified for a common interest. Now, generally, when you carry out your populism and populist politics, now again, populism is of two basic types: political populism and economic populism. Let's suppose you carry out or you take any political decision, you pass a law, you bring forward a new legislation which the general public had been demanding for a long period of time. Now, that is political populism, right? And what is economic populism? Let's suppose you provide something for free to the larger section of the population. You announce, you make the public announcement that, okay, all the loans that you had taken till now, all those loans are basically waived off. Now you don't have to repay those loans. So that is economic populism. Now, both of them have got basically their own limitations. In the case of political populism, what is the limitation? The limitation is very simple. And that is that let's suppose you bring a legislation, an act, or any kind of changes into the existing setup to, in a way, bring happiness or see to the demand of the larger masses. Most of the times, you are basically catering to the majority of the population. The marginalized section of the population, they are ignored in that populist politics. So, marginalization of weaker sections. and minority population. Now, this can cause discontentment both in the short, medium as well as in the long run. So, in the long run going ahead, what generally does happen is, and we have seen it happening ever since the post-independence era, where we have seen that the various different respective governments, both at the center as well as the state level, they have been passing these populist political measures. Now, many of them have raised the level of discontentment amongst the other section of the society who, let's suppose, is not benefiting from these measures. Now, that discontentment, if it increases beyond a certain level, beyond a critical point, that is when the societal harmony in itself, that comes or that becomes very volatile. But what about economic populism? Economic populism is something that we saw significantly on a very high rate during the late 60s and the early 70s. And again, that is something that we are seeing now. Now, during the late 60s and early 70s, basically there was a clarion call which was followed across the globe, and in fact not across the globe but across the country rather, where we talked about that how the industrialists of our country, they are looting us in some way or the other. So you had a large-scale nationalization processes which were carried out. Now, while it can be argued that that nationalization process of banks, etc., that was carried out to bring about inclusivity, financial inclusion, etc., but the argument is that even today, if you take a look at it, then almost up till a decade and a half back, we did not manage to achieve financial inclusion of the large masses. Why? Because the nationalization process did not fulfill its purpose. So economic populism, while it can basically rouse the popular spirit and basically give you that immediate amount of relief in certain cases, in the long run it can be damaging. We have seen that during the late 60s and 70s, the governments of the state, of the center, of various different political parties, all of them, up till the 80s and the 90s as well, they had a frequent problem of deficit financing. Right? And deficit financing, you would have read in the subject of economics, what is deficit financing? Where basically you end up spending so much more. You borrow from RBI and you ask the RBI that, okay, I will not be repaying you the amount of money that I have borrowed from you. You do one thing, you print the currency again. Now, in that case, what happens? As and when RBI keeps on printing and used to keep on printing the fresher currency notes, that would increase the substantial amount of money supply, bring about inflation at very high rates across the country, and also would give rise to the black economy. Now, that deficit financing, thankfully, after the 91 reforms, that was a thing of the past. And various successive governments since the early 90s, basically they worked about fiscal prudence, about how to ensure that the deficit does not increase beyond a set limit, and so on. They were working upon that. Now, again, something that you observe in the recent past is that again, and I'm not saying that, or the article itself here does not mention that this political party or that political party. Article also basically talks about the common ground where larger political setup of the country and the political class of the country, again, they are resorting to economic populism by waiving off loans, by giving short-term monetary benefits, assured income promises, etc. Now, that can bring about a lot of economic hardships going ahead into the future. We have seen the case unfolding in, for example, the state of Karnataka, where the promises made by the government, for example, for the various different types of economic populism and populistic measures basically has put the government in a bind because now they are cash strapped and they are resource starved. So that is where the long-term economic benefit of the nation is, and also the state is also damaged by the process. Now, all of this has come into existence because of a basic fundamental that the conventional models of growth and development which the world followed for a significant period of time, now that appears to have failed the expectation of the larger public. Because the model of economic growth which was earlier propagated by the Bretton Woods institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, now they had basically been propagating the kind of economic development where they would say that, look, development is like a tide. where if the high tide comes, all the boats will rise. So in the sense that if the development in a society happens, all the sections of the society will benefit. And there, they basically advocated the trickle-down approach, the trickle-down effect in the economic setup. Now, what is the trickle-down effect? The trickle-down effect is that if you carry out the developmental process at any particular strata, the other sections, let's suppose you carry out developmental process only in the manufacturing sector. With the help of the manufacturing sector, the local industries will also benefit. So that will end up benefiting the lower sections and eventually the lower income bracket of the society as well. But oftentimes, that trickle-down effect, as we have observed with cases across the world, all that it has done was, it has led to an increase in the level of inequalities. It has given rise to crony capitalism in many of the countries of the world as well. We have ample examples in the South American economies, in the African economies as well, where the entire trickle-down effect model has basically been put into trash. Now, here, the problem which arises with that trickle-down model of economic setup is that you have distribution problems. In the sense that, let's suppose there is capital which has been made by the country, some amount of money has been earned, let's suppose as taxes, as any sectoral development. Now that distribution of those benefits, that is always a problem, because you don't know which particular section requires what amount of help or support or a direct cash dole out. So that is why, because this has been put into risk, that is why you have the development and populism debate, which is ever so enlarged. So what is it that we should do ahead going into the future? So first of all, we need to ensure that when we talk about development, that development is comprehensive enough. And secondly, we need to ensure that even, let's suppose we make any promises which are populistic in nature, and that is done by everyone nowadays. So any of the promises that we make which are populistic in nature, we have to ensure whether that will end up alienating the minority section of the country. If it is so, then that should not be done. And secondly, if it will end up putting us in a kind of an economic fix, let's say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that is again an issue that we need to cater off today. For example, one of those economic populist measures is the revival of the old pension scheme. Now, it was a kind of one of those measures which was taken by subsequent reports of the Planning Commission that, look, that pension scheme, the old pension scheme that was referred to, now that is causing substantial amount of revenue deficit across the state as well as the central government, so it should be put to end. So it has been more than a decade and a half since that had been abandoned as an idea, and fiscal prudence was returning to the states. But again, once all the states are now in a race to promise that, along with the other promises, so, and regardless of the political party, so that again puts in jeopardy all the basic progresses which had been done in terms of economic and fiscal prudence. So going ahead into the election year, that is what is recommended, that in any electoral democracy, rather than holding unsustained promises and ensuring the measurement of development or the measuring yardsticks as a kind of one-sided affair, we need to take a holistic look at the society. Okay? Now, moving ahead to the second article. The second article talks about the criminal law bills and a hollow decolonization. This has again appeared in page 6. That is the editorial section, and this is relevant for your GS paper 2. Now here, what does this article talk about? So basically, this article is holding a kind of a critical argument for the introduced Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita Bill 2023. Now, in the final sessions of the parliament, the monsoon session of the parliament, you basically would have observed the introduction of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita Bill. Now, that has been put for the recommendation and basically analysis of the parliamentary committees. Now, in the meanwhile, the argument or the objective put forward for the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita Bill was basically that the IPC, that is the Indian Penal Code of 1860, which still governs the criminal practices and basically the police actions across the country. Now, they are a thing of the colonial legacy. Now, IPC initially was brought forward for the region of Ireland by the Britishers. That was brought forward and induced for the region of Ireland to control that particular population. And they simply changed its perspective to fit it for the Indian population. So always the argument which has been put forward is that the IPC in a way symbolizes the relationship between colonial masters and the subjects, where all the population and all the subjects, they are treated with utmost amount of suspicion through and through. And that is where even in the basis of suspicion, and you don't trust the citizenry in general, so you can incarcerate or imprison an individual for a long duration of time, and the individuals or the citizenry, they are supposed to be subjugated and basically bow down before the colonial authorities. So even after independence, as we followed that model of IPC, the argument had always been that even after independence, the government of India still holds that role as a colonial master and treats its citizen with an utmost amount of suspicion. Now, in order to append that, and the argument and the objective is to decolonize the entire process, we have introduced the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita Bill. Now here what we will do is that there are certain contentious issues which have been raised here in this article, where it argues that on matters of sedition, on matters of terrorism, on matters of organized crime, the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita basically is still the same as the IPC. So first of all, let us have a brief preview of that, what the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita Bill 2023 is about. Very briefly, the important principles here. So that Nyaya Sanhita Bill basically was introduced in Lok Sabha, and it seeks to repeal the Indian Penal Code 1860. Now, the key changes which have been brought about is in sedition. Now, the IPC, that is the Indian Penal Code here, used to define sedition as bringing or attempting to bring hatred or contempt or exciting dissatisfaction towards the government. Now, this would generally involve, or basically the outcome would be a 3-year imprisonment or a life imprisonment, in certain cases even worse. Now, this has been changed. Right? Now, once you have changed this, so the bill removes this offense. It instead penalizes following certain provisions. For example, exciting or attempting to excite secession, right? Separatism tendencies, armed rebellion, or subversive activities, right? So in a way, willingly or willfully exciting these kinds of activities, giving rise to these activities, encouraging feelings of separatist activities, endangering sovereignty or unity and integrity of India. These have been included as the acts which are going to be penalized. Now, while the term sedition has been removed, but then these particular activities, they do pertain to a kind of imprisonment of 7 years, and in certain cases even death penalty has been included in that. So they might involve exchange of words or signs, electronic communication, or use of financial means. So the article basically argues that, look, earlier only sedition was something which was penalized. But now, by including these measures where electronic communication, use of financial transaction, if it is carried out between individuals amongst one of them, let's suppose, who is encouraging these hateful speeches, etc., then the penalization will be very strict. So in a way, the article argues that you have expanded the scope of sedition while you have removed the term, but you have expanded the scope. You have further increased the amount of penalty associated with sedition. But the counter argument to that again holds is that nowadays, with the changing scenario, with the changing technology, you don't need to stand up in the city center to announce certain hate speeches out there. The electronic medium, the email, the dark web, etc., they are more than sufficient to not only incite but give fuel to the fire which enrages once these tendencies, they start emerging. And we have seen this playing out in the recent issues and the recent trends which are going out around certain particular section of population in Canada, etc., where you would observe that a lot of the message exchange, lot of the activities which are basically carried out, now they are carried out not because of physical presence of the individual themselves, but by various contacts through financial means. They end up paying the people, and someone else becomes the face of that criminal activity. So that is the logic or the objective which is cited in the bill, right? And the criticism of it is you have expanded the scope of it. Now, terrorism. Now, terrorism is a particular terminology which haunts us and which has haunted us for decades now. Now, the bill defines terrorism as an act that intends to threaten the unity, integrity, and security of the country, to intimidate the general public or disturb public order, right? So, anything which basically intends to damage the basic territorial and social integrity and harmony of the country, along with disturbing public order. So they would include using firearms, bombs, or hazardous substances to cause death, danger to life, or spread a message of fear, destroying property or disrupting essential services. Activities included in the treaties listed in the second schedule of the Unlawful Activities Act, UAPA, such as unlawful seizure of aircraft or taking of hostages. Now, that has been included under the aspect of terrorism as per the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. Now, the argument that this article holds is that, look, earlier also under the provisions of Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, UAPA basically. Now, you had very different or very stringent measures by which the police could incarcerate a particular section of the population for longer duration, and many of the times unjustifiably so. Now, what you have done is you have further increased the scope by including the aspects such as destroying property and disrupting essential services. Now, this can also be caused under normal protests, under normal strike conditions, etc. Now, under these provisions, the police and the police force, if they want, if their own political leaders and their own political heads, they want it, now terrorism charges can be imposed on individuals carrying out that. And also, in a way, the article argues that you have expanded the political or the police powers so significantly that there is no coming back from it. You have basically made it much more draconian as compared to the Indian Penal Code 1860 as well. And the argument which has been put forward by the objective of the bill again is that, again, the facets of terrorism, of carrying out terrorist acts, of instilling fear in the minds of people, those methodologies are not the same what used to remain 50 years back or 20 years back. They are continuously changing. So that is why we are basically adhering to those changes. So again, for every argument, there is a counter argument. For every particular counter argument, there is a particular logic which has also been put forward. You have to be aware of both of them. Organized crime. Now, organized crime, various different state governments also have passed their own particular laws for organized crime. For example, Makoka, which is very, very draconian and so on. But when we talk about organized crime, the bill defines organized crime as what? A continuing unlawful activities such as kidnapping, extortion, contract killing, land grabbing, financial scams, cyber crimes, all of them are basically a part of organized crime, carried out by the use of violence, intimidation, and other unlawful means to obtain material or financial benefit, carried out by individuals acting singly or a larger group jointly as members on the behalf of a crime syndicate. All of these have been included in organized crime. Now, it has been argued in front of the courts as well earlier also that, again, the same argument holds, that basically how you treat the organized crime network is very similar to how the Britishers would treat the citizens, where the general trust which is required in the citizenry is absent, due to which there's a larger disconnect which is developing between the ruling class and the normal citizenry. Now, again, this article tells that basically and holds the argument that now the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, it has expanded the scope of organized crime. Again, it has increased the police powers. So, what are the various different arguments which have been put forward against the bill? Right, let us take a look into it. First of all, the relationship between the state and the citizens remain the same. So that defies the purpose of introducing that Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita bill. Why? Because the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita bill, the aim was to decolonize the penal code and decolonize the way in which the law and order machinery functions. Now here, it is also argued that fair enough, you carry out the process of decolonization, but just by changing the course you are not going to achieve something. You have to ensure that police reforms, they are carried out. All the various different state governments, they are postponing the police reforms, or they are basically ignoring the police reforms, because eventually the police force, and sadly that is the case, which Supreme Court had also issued a warning about for one of the state police services, that you are basically becoming subservient to your political masters. And that is where the politicians, they basically eye the police force as their servants who will do their bidding. Now that is again one of the root causes due to which you have various different organized crime syndicates which basically are able to flourish under various different regions, under various different amount of protection. Also, how we handle the prisons, and how do we handle the under trials who have not yet been convicted, who are just accused of some crime. Now majority or significant amount of people incarcerated in our prisons, they are under trials. Now that tells you that justice delayed is also justice denied. So basically, if you are putting an under trial into prison for a very long period of time, the very basic purpose of putting someone in prison is for correctional purposes. But there, when you are putting someone in prison for a longer period of time, not only are you damaging the long-term reputation and possibilities in life thereafter, but also in a way, you are introducing them into the criminal syndicate and criminal world as well. So here, all the proposed changes further increase the scope of activities covered as criminal acts, further increases the police powers, no scope for police reforms, lack of prison reforms. So the new bill basically, as is argued, does not solve the purpose for which it had been drafted. And in many of the areas, it is also alleged that it is poorly drafted. But still, the bill is in a kind of a consultation stage where the parliamentary committees are basically looking at it, and the bill has still not become an act. When it becomes an act, basically there will be certain amendments which are sought to be done in that bill, and then eventually the purpose has to be solved, where the citizen trusts the government, that if the government is doing something, there might be a reason behind it, and the government also needs to trust the citizenry, rather than suddenly increasing to a draconian level the police powers, where again that distrust begins. Again, where people start holding their own justice system, where you have a rise of public justice in the sense, for example, let's suppose public lynching and so on. Now, all those activities, they come to rise when people lose faith in the existing justice system. So that needs to be corrected if we want to bring about a better handling of the criminal system in the country. That is what the article is about. Now, after that, moving on to the third article. Now, the third article, very briefly again mentioned in the page of the editorial section, that is the page 6. Now, this talks about capturing the rains. This is relevant for your GS paper 1 as well as GS paper 3, that is the disaster management portion and the portion of geography. Now, this year, when you had the rainfall, the advent of monsoons when they happened, basically the expectation was that, okay, this year we are going to receive slightly deficient amount of rainfall. There will be a deficit in the amount of rainfall caused because we are expecting an El Nino condition. What is an El Nino condition, by the way? El Nino, simply put, even though we have covered it before, but when we talk about the El Nino condition, we talk about heating of Central and Eastern Pacific. Now, this always reduces the amount of rain received by in India. So this was the expectation that 2023-24 is going to be El Nino year. So we are going to receive lesser rainfall. Now that was going to be a departure from the era of 2019 to 2022, where we had the conditions of La Nina. And La Nina basically always brings heavier amount of rainfall or excessive amount of rainfall in India. And why is it so? Because La Nina, that was the era in 2019 to 22, and that was a very rare condition where we experienced the La Nina conditions to prevail continuously for 3 years, what was also referred to as triple dip La Nina, which is very rare, that for 3 consecutive years you experience the condition of La Nina. So that means you have 3 consecutive years of La Nina. And what is La Nina per se? Heating off, or the phase of cooling off Pacific, and that is associated with higher rains in India. Now, here, this year also, if you take a look at it, while June was comparatively drier, the month of July and also later part of July, you would have observed substantially heavy amount of rainfall occurring in many parts of the country, leading to issues and problems of flood, devastation, lot of cloudburst events with greater amount of frequency. All of these were happening. And the rainfall distribution is not uniform across the country at all. Overall, we have basically received a kind of a lesser than average rainfall, a deficit amount of rainfall. 9% of the country still has received excessive amount of rains. So, despite the prediction that the entire country is going to receive deficient amount of rainfall, 9% received excessive rains, 18% received deficit rains, and rest of the country received normal amount of rainfall. So imagine, in the year when we are expected to receive very lesser amount of rainfall due to El Nino, close to around 25 or close to around 70 to 75% of the country did manage to receive average and normal rainfall. That tells us something about the prediction models that we are using. We are basically not able to capture the exact details of the environment. We are not able to capture the details of the geographical changing patterns which are happening. So, there is an increase in the rise of the unique events that we are observing. For example, high incidence of cloudbursts. Now, whenever you have these cloudbursts occur when? When you have sudden large amount of cloud which is unsustainable and basically it is unable to hold its own weight. So it gives way, causing huge amount of rainfall within a very short span of time. Now, this always leads to landslides in many of the cases, and flash floods as well. Now, increased amount of cloudburst, that is basically a symbol or a sign of climate change, where in the earlier you did not have so many cloudbursts because you had an expected amount of rainfall carried by the wind systems. They would bring that rainfall maybe in few mountainous areas here and there. One or the other sporadic event of cloudburst would happen, and that is it. But now that has become much more prominent. That has become much more common. So that high incidence of cloudburst is a point of concern. Now, western disturbance. This is something that we have observed as an exceptional case this year. Generally, when we talk about western disturbances, what do we mean by western disturbance? So western disturbances, these are extratropical storms or temperate cyclonic formations, extratropical storms developing over Mediterranean, okay, and travels eastward towards India. Basically, these extratropical storms, they become centers of low pressure. So that low pressure travels towards India, causing huge amount of rainfall, causing rains. And that is because of the traveling low pressure. Now, how is that extratropical storm created? This is generally created because of mixing of very cold and very warm air. Okay, so that is something that we experience in the winter months, where the wind or basically the temperature of air around the tropical area that is high, and you have cold conditions in the northern portion of Europe, etc. So the cold and the warm air, whenever they will interact in the region, for example in Mediterranean, they will give rise to these low pressure systems and a kind of a depression or an extratropical storm. Now this travels with the help of the westerly winds towards India, especially during the months of November. December and January is where they are very prominent, and they start fading out from the month of late February. By March and April is when they come to an end, right? Because by April end and by May, there's an overall warming of the northern hemisphere taking place, so you don't have these separate conditions. But this year what has happened is that the many portions of Europe, even during the month of May, June and July, they did experience colder conditions, few portions. And you had the region of the tropics being extraordinarily warm. Now this difference in temperature, very cold, very warm, that is also an outcome of climate change. Climate change does not only mean that the entire planet will keep on burning like an oven, no. You will have certain areas which will continue to remain cold, certain areas which will continue to remain very, very hot, very, very warm. So that is why this year, western disturbances, they were present throughout the summer season. In fact, it was these western disturbances which combined with the monsoonal phenomena which caused such amount of devastation in the region of Himachal Pradesh and even in certain areas of Uttarakhand and even Delhi. Delhi also got flooded quite sufficiently because of, again, a combination of western disturbances. So a phenomena which would end in April at max continued till the month of July, August. So that tells you climate in front of us is changing. So the rainfall pattern is changing. So that means we need better prediction so that we can analyze, okay, this year western disturbances, they can be existent till August, etc. It should not be a kind of a post-mortem analysis, which is generally the norm that we are following in our climate prediction models, that after it has rained, then we come out with a kind of a reason as if we are appearing for an examination that, you know, why that rain happened? Because this was the issue, this was the low pressure system which was traveling and so on. Now, the people who have been impacted by it, the population who is impacted by it, what will they do with the analysis thereafter? What is the benefit of that analysis thereafter? So that is why better forecasting, so that you can tell the people that maybe the next week you are going to receive so heavy amount of rainfall that the rivers can flood in that area. For that, better prediction models. Now, even this year, while many areas experienced deluge-like flooded conditions, you had drought-like conditions in Maharashtra, Chhattisgarh, Bihar and Karnataka. Now that in itself brings forward the twin problems of flood and drought. Now that is where water conservation becomes a key issue, where in these areas you have crop failures because of lack of water, and in the other areas you have crop failures because of excess amount of water, right? And normal to above normal rainfall is predicted from the month of October to December. So it defies the very existence of an El Nino year. Even this month, you would observe that almost the entirety of the country, while this is the time of the retreat of the monsoon, and IMD has virtually declared that monsoon has retreated from the region of Delhi now, but still, many parts of the country, they are still receiving very high amount of rainfall. Now that can also impact the harvesting season which is coming. It will impact the food security going ahead into the future. So what is it that we need going ahead? First of all, we need resilient infrastructure. Resilient in the sense that the infrastructure which is not impacted by the slight vagaries in the amount of rainfall or dry conditions thereby. Where even when we talk about the basic connectivity models, when we talk about the basic irrigation methodologies, all of them, they should be such, water supply canals, etc., they should be such that the supply should be maintained through the year. Because climate change is no longer a theoretical concept that is going to hit us 50 years down the line. It is hitting us as we speak. Better forecasting models are required. This is a must. This is an absolute must. For that, we need to spend more on climate research. We need to spend more on understanding global phenomena. Something which is happening in the Pacific is impacting India. Something which is happening in the region of Northern Atlantic is also going to impact India. Water security needs to be ensured through retention of water. In smaller areas also, we need to be able to retain water for a longer period and a longer duration of time. And we need to go for climate resilient cropping so that food security is not impacted. Those kind of agricultural methods, those kind of crops which can withstand dry conditions also, some heavy rain also, different soil conditions like millets, those crops should be promoted. And overall mixed farming as a methodology should also be promoted so that to ensure. Now what is mixed farming? Mixed farming is basically where you carry out crop cultivation plus animal rearing at the same time. That is mixed farming. So in that case, let's suppose due to uncertainties in nature, the crop cultivation goes to waste, but then still you will have the animals with you where you can sell the animal products such as the milk, meat, etc., skin, etc., and you can earn some amount of income. So this will ensure that the economy, especially the rural economy, where still almost around 50% of our population is directly or indirectly dependent on agricultural output, the economy does not crumble immediately because of these vagaries of nature. That is a must going ahead into the future. Okay? Now, moving ahead to the next article, building BRICS for the future. Now, recently before the G20 summit, we had the BRICS summit in South Africa, which was held. And after that, there was a lot of criticism, there was a lot of talk about, generally across the Western press and the Western media, that the BRICS is not relevant anymore. Because look, China is a country which is not working with India. India is not interested in ties with China. Russia is getting isolated. So the BRICS in itself is crumbling away. Now, a brief recap for all of you. BRICS basically is a terminology which was cited, it was originally BRIC, B-R-I-C, which was cited by Jim O'Neill, who was an economist in Goldman Sachs. Now, he cited this term in 2001. And basically, the argument was that these four economies, they would end up capturing the global economic scenario by the year 2050. Because it was argued that by the year 2050, this would represent almost 47% of the global population. And substantial amount of global GDP is represented even today by these countries. They represent close to around 36% of the global GDP. So that was the citing which was made, or that was the prediction which was made by Jim O'Neill. And from that arose the term BRICS. These countries added the country of South Africa in 2010. And the BRICS was formed, and they carried on these consultations generally for economic consultation. You have to understand that BRICS, all the various different arguments which are put forward that BRICS is about to come to an end, etc., all of that, they basically liken it to committees or various groupings such as NATO and so on. But BRICS is purely economical, for economical convergence, for economical participation, and also seeking an alternate economic model of growth and development as attested by the Western economies, by the Bretton Woods institutions such as World Bank, IMF, etc. So BRICS was supposed to offer an alternative. So if we want to check the relevance of BRICS today and going ahead into the future, we have to check the relevance based upon these aspects, not on the aspect whether India and China, they are conducting joint military drills or not. That is not the crucible. Okay, so evolution of BRIC has happened. In this particular summit meeting which happened in South Africa, 6 new member countries were added, and this becomes relevant for your prelims as well. In prelims, they will not ask you the question that which of these countries have been added recently. They can ask you the question which of these have been the latest additions, or which of these are not the founding members, and so on. So that becomes relevant. So Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, Argentina, and UAE, they have been added to the grouping of the BRICS. Now that in itself talks about diversification into those economies which are also seeking a kind of an alternative setup from the Western dominance. Because for a long period of time it has been felt that the Western powers, they are monopolizing the way in which the various different methodologies are carried out of economic lending, of economic governance, and so on. So they are always seeking a kind of an alternative. So it is important to look at long-term economic gains. So 36% of the global GDP is represented by these BRIC nations. So that means going ahead into the future, this will be a kind of a resolute alternative, a substantial alternative to the G7 nations and the heft that the G7 nations impose. They represent a large global population, expected to be close to around 50% of the global population to be represented by BRICS by the year 2050. So the interest of that larger population, be it for their economic inclusion, be it for climate change, it is expected that BRICS will end up representing the larger interest of the global south. Economic participation, inclusion amongst the high table discussions, and so on. And all these countries, be it China, be it India, all of them are directly or indirectly advocating the same. Even India, during the G20 presidency and the G20 summit, one of the most landmark decisions which have happened was basically India provided membership to the African Union as well, right? So that is how changes are being brought about. It is an alternative to the polarized global geopolitics, okay? So basically, presently, the Western countries, they impose sanctions on certain countries. Now, that sanction oftentimes is unilateral and not represented by the larger section or the larger interest of the population. So that can be also punitive. So you need an alternative economic setup, growth of alternative currencies and economic models, which seeks to defy the dollar monopoly and the dollar dominance, right? Then continent of the future, Asia and Africa. These particular continents, they substantially lack the power to enhance their opinion or voice their opinion across the major tables of the globe, decision-making tables of the globe, because they are not included in those decision-making processes. Even though these are the continents which are going to grow into the future. These are the ones who are going to represent the larger section. These are the ones who are going to have the larger interest debatable for the future. So BRICS provides an alternative representation for them. And also treatment of migrants already due to the various crises which you follow in the region of Africa, how the migrant population and even the migrants from Asia, how they are being treated by the European nations and the North American nations, that has exposed the hypocrisy of the so-called developed nations of the West, where even during the COVID pandemic, the hypocrisy was exposed that they can say all the good things about the global good. But when it comes to action, that is when the global south needs to stick together. And BRICS can end up representing that momentum, increased momentum and the increased gains being made by the global south. So the article argues that BRICS is still relevant. It is going to be relevant because of the demography, because of the economic realities, and also because of the changing geopolitics, because of fractured geopolitics, and all the countries who are seeking a kind of an alternative. Okay? Now, after that, we move at few of the articles relevant for only your prelims. Very briefly, we'll take a look at that. So basically, first of all, Medicine Nobel 2023 was awarded to two individuals who carried out the joint research for vaccine development. And you had Katalin Kariko and Drew Weissman, who were given that Nobel Prize. Now, Katalin Kariko becomes the only 13th woman to be basically given that Nobel Prize. Now, why have they been given the Nobel Prize for medicine? Because they have developed the platform for vaccine development by mRNA type of vaccine development. What is mRNA? That is basically messenger RNA. That is messenger ribonucleic acid. Now, what is the work that mRNA does? So, this mRNA-based vaccine development is the reason why they have been given this. And if you recall, many of the COVID vaccines which were developed in a very short span of time were also developed because they've developed themselves on that mRNA platform, right? So, the purpose is that DNA will send a message, and that message will be carried out by the mRNA, which will hit the cytoplasm of the body cells, and thereby that message can be, for example, development of a particular kind of a protein, development of a certain marker, and so on. And then the body's immune system will react to it. So that is how you can develop a kind of a vaccine for any kind of diseases. Just you need to put the RNA of that particular individual disease that you are trying to cure. So unlike DNA, which acts as an intrusion manual, or rather an instruction manual for life contained in every cell, including the protein markers and so on, mRNA is a temporary piece of genetic code that can create a protein or repair a damage. And this is sought as a kind of a vaccine delivery mechanism. For that, Nobel Prize has been given. So all that you need to be aware of is why that Nobel Prize has been given for the purpose of medicine. Then, moving ahead, Astra BVR missile is to be inducted finally in the Air Force by the year end. And already we are observing that various different platforms such as the Sukhoi 30 MKI, all of these, they have basically deployed these, and in many of them they have already built the Astra Mark 1 BVR. Now what is BVR? BVR basically stands for Beyond Visual Range. Visual range. So the concept is, while 40 years back, 50 years back, or 30 years back, the air fight that used to happen, what is also referred to as the dog fights between the airplanes, that used to happen with the aircrafts maneuvering with respect to each other, coming in close contact, evading each other, and firing missiles at each other. But now that standoff doesn't take place anymore. Now with the development of technology, you can basically shoot down an aircraft which is 100 kilometer, 160 kilometer away from you, 70 kilometer away from you, without even coming in the visual range, because you are able to detect them. Right? So you don't have to really confront the air enemy. You can directly take them down if you have these BVR missiles. Now, India, for a long time, for its air force systems, that relied on the Russian air-to-air missile that used to be R-77 system of missiles. Now these R-77s, they had a limited range, limited applicability, as we also observed during the case of the Balakot airstrike, when the next day the Pakistani Air Force tried to intrude. Now we had the R-77 missiles installed in the various different aircraft, so we could not have that kind of a punch pack, whereas the F-16s that the Pakistani Air Force had, they had the AMRAAM missiles, which are developed by United States. Now the AMRAAM missiles, they have a range of 160 kilometers. That means they can shoot down an enemy airplane 160 kilometers away, whereas the R-77 could shoot down an enemy only 60 kilometers away. So think about it. An Indian aircraft, if it wants to shoot down a Pakistani aircraft, it needs to get almost 60 kilometers closer to them. And much before that, the Indian aircraft can be shot down because of the AMRAAM missiles. So that basically tells you that there is a growing need for the BVR kind of missiles. And Astra Mark 1, which has been developed indigenously for a long period of time, that fills that shoes. Astra Mark 1's range is expected to be somewhere in the range of 110 to 120 kilometers. Much more than the R-77, and they can be fired at different height, and they have a greater utility, and much importantly, they are manufactured domestically, so we can scale up the production whenever we want and howsoever we want. Air Force is also looking at the development of Astra Mark II, which will fill the shoes, and where the expected range is going to exceed. It is expected to exceed 160 kilometer, which is the farthest that the BVR missiles operate as of now. So that is where Astra Mark II is going to follow, and that is also going to be a beyond visual range missile. Then the last topic of the day, the World Health Organization finally did approve the use of malaria vaccine with adjuvant tech. Now, malaria vaccine, or the vaccine for malaria, has been elusive and has eluded a lot of researchers for a large period of time. And large sections of the population in the tropical part of the world, they have been impacted by malaria. So here this vaccine again has been developed by the Oxford and Serum Institute of India, just like you had the vaccine developed during COVID times by the Serum Institute. Similarly, the same collaboration has developed this vaccine, where Serum Institute is expected to scale up the production going ahead into the future. Now here, basically the vaccine is also what is referred to as R21 matrix M. Okay, that is the vaccine which has been recommended. Now here you will use the term, or you will hear about the term adjuvant. What is that adjuvant tech? So adjuvant basically is a substance that enhances the body's immune response to an antigen. So if we simplify it, many of the times when, let's suppose, you are injected with a kind of a vaccine, your body is unable to detect those particular materials in the vaccine. So if the body is unable to detect, obviously the body won't be able to respond to that. Body won't be able to generate the immune response to that disease when it falls upon. So adjuvants are those materials which in a way give the alarm to the body that, look, these are the materials coming into your system. So develop a kind of an antibody, develop the kind of an immune system for fighting that. So it makes the vaccine delivery much more effective. It makes the role of the vaccine also much more complete. Okay. Now, finally, let us take a look at the questions which can be framed. Discuss the relevance of BRICS in the modern fractured geopolitical setup. So here, it is only a 10 marker or a 150 worded answer which is required to be written. So in the introduction in this, write about what do you understand by BRICS? From the coining of the term to the representation of the term. And then in the body part, talk about the relevance and how it is becoming relevant and will still continue to remain relevant going ahead into the future. So that is all that you have to discuss, because you have to talk about the dollar dominance, you have to talk about the fractured geopolitical situation or the polarized world, whether you are with the Western world or you are against the Western world. People are seeking an alternative representing the feelings and the interest of the global South. All those factors you can represent. Eventually, in the conclusion, you have to write that multilateral forums such as BRICS, G20, etc. are going to become an essence in the coming century, or in the going ahead into this century, because they will represent the interest of the people rather than representing the interest of the power groups as indicated in the previous century. So they are going to be much more representative. So with that, you can conclude your answer. Then the obligations of electoral democracy gives a priority to the populist measures as compared to developmental measures. Comment. So here in the introduction, first of all, you have to talk about what do you understand by electoral democracy, right? So electoral democracy is what? That is something that you have to talk about. Where elections are held, people basically they choose the government with the help of the elections which are held periodically. Now that is the brief introduction. Now there we have the role of both populism as well as developmental mechanism. Now, where is it that the developmental process that we talk about, where we have sidelined the development and narrowed down the approach of development to be followed? We have now narrowed down the approach for the, let's suppose, the populism measures which are to be followed. What are the lacunae or the drawbacks, the benefits of each of them associated? That is what you can highlight. In this, the conclusion becomes, or the later part of the body also becomes very relevant, where you have to basically highlight the part that if you want to, or as a welfare state, one needs to cater to the complete or the entirety of the section of the society for both the medium term and the long term development. That will happen if we keep ourselves within the limits of the political and economic boundaries for both the long term and the mid term benefit without marginalizing any particular section. With that, you can conclude the answer. Okay, so that is where we'll end the session. If you like the particular session, if you like the content of it, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. I would urge all of you that do go to the Telegram channel, look at the objective questions which have been framed from the topic and analyze your level of understanding as well. We meet again tomorrow. Till that point of time, do take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.